So in the 1950s, during the Algerian War for Independence, women actually weaponized the very thing the French military considered a symbol of, like ultimate passive submission.
You're talking about their veils, right?
Exactly. Their veils. They use them to hide weapons and explosives, and they'd slip right past these heavily armed colonial checkpoints because, well, the soldiers simply couldn't fathom that these women possessed any agency.
Yeah, it completely scrambled the colonizers' brains. Because, we like to think of rebellion like a light switch. You're either submitting in the dark or you flip the switch and you're fighting back.
Right, but what happens when the only way to survive is to live on a dimmer switch?
That is the defining question of everyday survival under oppressive systems. I mean, the light switch binary is comforting, but it totally falls apart when you look at how human beings actually navigate power in the real world.
Which is exactly what we're getting into today. So, welcome to another deep dive. If you're joining us, you know the promise. We are taking a complex, highly nuanced topic and giving you the shortcut to being incredibly well-informed without all the overwhelming information overload.
And today's source material is fantastic. It's an incredibly insightful 2026 academic paper from the Confluence Journal of Multidisciplinary Studies by scholars Miriam Ethbibis and Brahim Barhoun.
Right, and our mission today is to explore this concept called ambivalent resistance. Like, how do oppressed people, specifically women in this context, how do they fight back when they can't just burn the whole system to the ground?
Yeah, we're going to look at this through the lens of a really famous Moroccan novel, The Bottom of the Jar by Abdelatif Laâbi.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because before we can even get to Morocco, we need to understand the theoretical trap that marginalized people often fall into, right?
Absolutely. To understand that trap, we really have to look at the work of the renowned postcolonial theorist, Spivak. She wrote extensively about the subaltern.
The subaltern. That's basically an academic term for the deeply disenfranchised, right?
Exactly. These are the people at the absolute bottom of the power structure, the ones who are just completely written out of the main historical narrative. And Spivak uses this really striking historical example to show how the voice of the subaltern is just, well, it's basically stolen.
Right.
She looks at the historical Indian practice of the sati, which is the self-immolating widow.
Wow, okay. That's a highly visible, highly controversial practice where a widow would burn to death on her husband's funeral pyre.
Yes. And during British colonial rule in India, the colonial administration officially outlawed the sati. But the mechanics of how and why they did this are crucial here.
Because they didn't just do it quietly.
No, not at all. The British framed this ban as a grand moral crusade. They explicitly claimed they were saving brown women from brown men.
Oh, wow. So they position themselves as the civilized saviors, bringing enlightenment to a supposedly backward culture.
Right. And by doing that, the British found a highly convenient moral justification for their continued military occupation and, economic extraction of India.
Well,
What's fascinating here is how the woman's actual voice is just entirely lost in this.
because they took a localized practice and weaponized it for their own geopolitical PR. But obviously, the Indian nationalist movement fighting for independence didn't just accept that framing, right?
Oh, they fought back fiercely. But their counterargument was not to actually consult the women
Of
involved.
course not.
Instead, the Indian nationalists claimed that the women actually wanted to die. They wrote these long treatises defending the practice as an act of the utmost piety and wifely devotion.
Wow.
So in their narrative, these women were suddenly transformed into the pure, uncorrupted bearers of national tradition, standing strong against Western imperial corruption.
You know, it sounds remarkably like a bitter divorce custody battle.
Yeah.
You have both parents standing in front of a judge screaming, "This is what the kid wants. I know what's best for the kid."
Yes, exactly.
And meanwhile, the kid is sitting right there in the room, completely silenced, unable to get a single word in edgewise.
That analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. The tragedy of the subaltern is that if the marginalized person does try to speak, their words are instantly twisted by whichever side can use them as political ammunition.
She becomes a mere pawn.
Right. If the British win the argument, she's a helpless victim who needs a white savior. If the nationalists win, she's a willing martyr for the nation. In both scenarios, she is denied the agency to simply speak for her own lived experience.
Okay, so if the Saudi was the ideological battleground in India, I'm guessing that as we shift our focus to the Arab world and the Maghreb, which is the focus of our source material today, the colonizers needed a different symbol to target.
They did, and they found that symbol in the veil. There's a really sharp observation on this from Fatima Mernissi, a prominent Moroccan sociologist. She points out that the veil became doubly encoded in the exact same way Spivak described the sati.
Wait, let me stop you there just to clarify that term. Doubly encoded. You mean the veil stops being just a piece of fabric and becomes a literal billboard? But depending on who's looking at it, there are two entirely different conflicting messages painted on it.
That hits the nail on the head. So let's look at the first message on that billboard, the one painted by the British and French colonial administrations. They developed an absolute obsession with liberating Arab women.
Right. Liberating in huge air quotes.
Exactly. And they arbitrarily decided that the ultimate singular metric of that liberation was removing the veil.
Which is incredibly convenient for the colonizers. Because as the paper points out, by boiling down the entire complex existence of women in these societies into one single item of clothing, the French and British could completely ignore actual systemic issues.
Oh, totally.
I mean, they didn't have to spend money or political capital on getting these women access to education or voting rights or political representation.
Exactly. The colonial powers were essentially exporting their own Western misogyny under the guise of feminist liberation. They had no genuine interest in dismantling patriarchy. They simply wanted to replace the local Islamic patriarchal norms with their own European ones.
So they were basically staging unveiling ceremonies as spectacles of colonial dominance.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
So just like in India, the local nationalist movements must have reacted to this colonial attack by pulling in the exact opposite direction.
They did. To counter the colonial narrative, Arab nationalist movements pushed for mandatory veiling. Suddenly, the veil was no longer just a garment, it was painted with the second message on that billboard.
It became a symbol of fierce national resistance.
Right, an emblem of authentic Muslim femininity designed to supposedly purify the culture from Western corruption.
But the sources reveal a pretty massive bait and switch here, don't they? Regarding what those nationalist leaders actually wanted post-independence. Mernissi points out that the nationalist discourse around women's liberation wasn't born out of some sudden desire for gender equality.
Oh, far from it. It was a cold, calculated economic strategy. When these newly independent nations were trying to stand on their own 2 feet, they desperately needed to rapidly build their economies.
Yeah.
And state building requires labor, which meant they needed women to enter the workforce to maximize productive potential.
So the state gets up on a podium and declares a new era of liberation, encouraging women to go work in the factories and offices.
Right, but here's the fine print of that contract. The state completely refused to liberate those same women from their traditional domestic chains.
Wow.
The nationalist leaders needed women to be economic agents for the state during the day, but demanded they remain entirely subservient wives and mothers at home at night.
It's the ultimate double burden. You give your labor to the nation from 9 to 5, and then you give your labor to the patriarchy from 5 to 9. The workload just doubled, but the power dynamic didn't shift an inch. Which brings up a massive question for you, the listener, to consider. How do you actually fight back in that environment? I mean, if you take the veil off, you're supposedly siding with the colonizers. If you keep it on, you're submitting to the nationalist patriarchy.
This raises an important question, right? How does a woman actually resist when both the colonizer and the nationalist are using her body as a political billboard? This is where we have to shift our perspective.
Okay, how so?
Well, if we only analyze massive top-down systems like colonialism or state patriarchy, women just look like trapped victims. But if we look closely at their daily lives on the ground, we see incredible agency. We see what theorist Dens Kanyoti calls the patriarchal bargain.
The patriarchal bargain.
Right.
So if bargaining is the theory, what does that actually look like in practice?
So the patriarchal bargain is the concept that women are acutely aware of the concrete physical and social constraints they live under. They know the exact rules of the game, because open insurrection is often dangerous. I mean, it could cost them their homes, their social standing, or even their lives. They strategize, they strike a bargain with the system, their resistance becomes covert.
And the paper provides a striking example of this, right, with the women of the Hold'em and Mennonite community.
Yes, exactly.
These women live under extremely strict conservative dress codes. They can't just throw away the regulated dresses and put on jeans because they'd be exiled from their entire community.
Right, the cost is way too high.
So instead, they subtly alter the hems of those dresses. It's a tiny, nearly invisible change to the outside world, but for the women wearing them, it is a massive assertion of self-ownership.
And the stakes can be even higher. Returning to the Algerian War example you mentioned at the start, the Algerian nationalist women understood exactly how the French soldiers perceived the veil as an indicator of passive, oppressed submission.
So they weaponized the soldiers' own prejudice against them.
Exactly. By selectively veiling and unveiling, they completely disrupted the colonial binary and turned a symbol of restriction into a tactical advantage.
Okay, but I want to push back on this idea of bargaining for a second. Playing devil's advocate here, isn't bargaining just a fancy academic phrase for giving in?
I see what you mean.
I mean, if you are still wearing the uniform, if you are still living under the roof and following the core rules, aren't you just complying? How is moving a hemline an inch an actual rebellion?
That tension you are feeling is exactly why theorists refer to this as feminist ambivalence. It is not giving, it is a highly calibrated survival mechanism.
Survival mechanism.
Right. You mimic the overarching rules to keep yourself safe, to maintain whatever limited status or protection the system affords you, but you subvert those rules in the margins. You are constantly oscillating between submission and resistance.
So it's not a heroic cinematic revolution where the oppressive castle is stormed.
No, not at all. It is a continuous daily negotiation of personal agency.
Survival math. You calculate exactly what you can afford to lose. You know, we're talking about entire empires, nations, massive historical movements. But human beings don't wake up in the morning and interact with colonialism over breakfast.
Right. They interact with their families.
Exactly. You interact with your spouse, your children, your neighbors. So let's bring all this theory down to earth and see what this survival math looks like for one specific woman. This brings us to Abdelatif Laâbi's memoir-style novel, The Bottom of the Jar.
Yeah, published in 2002, the book is a deeply personal exploration drawn heavily from Laâbi's own childhood in Fez, Morocco, during the 1950s.
And Laâbi himself is this towering cultural figure, right? He's a fiercely left-wing, politically engaged writer who was actually jailed in the 1970s for conspiracy against the state.
Yes, largely because of a dissident journal he founded called Soufflé. He firmly believed that literature must be a tool for social change, and he explicitly stated that his goal with this book was to give a voice to the voiceless.
Specifically, he aimed to give a voice to his own mother, Ghita. Laâbi was profoundly moved by the unseen sacrifices his parents made. Ghita was an illiterate woman who birthed and raised 11 children, living her entire life within the strict confines of a traditional patriarchal household.
He wanted to use his literary platform to finally let her speak.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because Laâbi bases the character of Ghita so closely on the complex reality of his actual mother, she completely refuses to fit into the neat little box of the pure victim.
She really does.
She ends up being a walking contradiction, a perfect embodiment of that feminist ambivalence.
She is remarkably self-aware of her oppression, and she does not suffer in silence.
Yeah.
She complains loudly and bitterly to anyone who will listen about the physical toll her life has taken.
Yeah, she laments, "I have become just like a cow."
Right. As soon as one baby was born, she was pregnant all over again. She literally cries up to the heavens, demanding to know, why couldn't I have been born a boy?
It's a completely unfiltered critique of the biological and social trap she finds herself in. She sees the gross unfairness of the system clear as day. But then in the very next breath, she turns around and violently enforces that exact same oppressive system on the women below her.
Her treatment of her new daughter-in-law is a startling shift in behavior.
It's brutal.
Uh-huh.
When the new daughter-in-law moves into the family compound, Ghita plays the welcoming host for exactly 3 days. On the 4th day, all the pleasantries vanish.
Gone completely.
She orders the younger woman to take over the heavy domestic chores, explicitly stating she needed to show the girl who was boss. Ghita strictly lays down the law, declaring men should be men and women should be women.
It's a total reversal.
You know, for anyone listening who has ever navigated a toxic corporate culture, you've probably seen a version of this play out.
Oh, absolutely.
You have the junior employee who is overworked, underpaid, constantly complaining about how unfair the management structure is. But then 10 years later, they finally get promoted. And instead of fixing the culture or dismantling the system that made them miserable, they turn around and become the exact same nightmare boss they used to complain about.
That is a phenomenal way to understand Ghita's actions. It seems utterly hypocritical on the surface. You know, the woman crying out against the injustice of being born female is now crushing another woman under those same rules.
Right.
But through the lens of the patriarchal bargain, her behavior follows a strict internal logic. Ghita is cashing in her chips.
She spent decades paying her dues into this system.
Exactly. She suffered through the endless pregnancies, the back-breaking domestic labor, the unquestioning submission to her husband. Now that she has survived long enough to become the elder matriarch, she expects the payout.
So upholding the patriarchy is her reward.
Upholding it is the only way she can access the sole source of power available to her, which is absolute authority over the domestic sphere and command over the younger women entering the household. If she dismantles the system now to be egalitarian, she loses her hard-won status as the boss.
She's not brainwashed by the patriarchy, she's just playing the only hand she was dealt to maximum effect. And this brings us back to how Ghita handles the ultimate ideological symbol we discussed earlier, the veil.
Oh, her relationship with it is a masterclass in strategic ambivalence.
There's a brilliant scene where Ghita goes to visit her son's future in-laws. The moment she gets inside the safety of their home, surrounded only by other women, she rips the veil off.
And she dramatically calls it a rag.
Yes, she calls it a rag and jokes that society treats women's faces like they're afflicted with leprosy. She is openly mocking the very core of the nationalist, patriarchal ideology.
She recognizes the absurdity and restriction of the garment, but the crucial detail is what happens when the visit concludes. When it is time to leave the private sphere, what does she do?
She puts the veil right back on, perfectly adjusting it for the street.
Exactly. She reavails herself because she understands the social cost of walking outside bareheaded is simply too high. She vents her anger in a safe, private space where it'll be received as relatable, subversive humor among peers, but she complies in public to protect her reputation and her family's standing.
She knows how to vent safely, but she also knows how to push the boundaries in real time. Like, there is a fantastic scene involving a family trip to Sidi Harazim.
Oh, the car ride scene. It perfectly illustrates the calculus of rebellion. During this trip, crammed into the family car, Ghita boldly takes off her veil entirely just so she can eat some snacks unencumbered.
Which is a huge deal.
Huge. Her young son, Namus, who serves as the stand-in for Laâbi as a child, he's sitting there terrified. He expects his father to explode in anger. He's bracing for a massive scandal, a real fideha.
Right, because according to the rigid binary rules of their society, she is openly defying her husband's authority and religious custom right in front of him.
Yet the father says absolutely nothing. Ghita did not rebel blindly. She had calculated the exact risk of that specific moment. She knew the enclosed environment of the moving car, combined with her specific, nuanced relationship with her husband after decades of marriage, meant she was safe to break the rule without facing retaliation.
She really mastered the dimmer switch.
Yeah.
Because later in the novel, in a completely different context, she behaves entirely differently.
At the religious shrine, right?
Yeah, at the shrine of Moulay Idris. There, she only lifts the veil a tiny fraction, just barely enough to slip a tumbler of water to her lips. She recognizes the shrine is a high-risk environment with intense social surveillance from strangers. The math changes, so her behavior changes.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Ghita proves that resistance isn't always a grand, sweeping revolution that overthrows the government. Sometimes resistance is taking off your veil to eat a snack in the family car because you've spent years calculating exactly how much freedom you can steal back without losing your home.
So what does this all mean? The journey we went on today reveals so much about the human condition. We started with high-level academic theories about Spivak's sati and the doubly encoded nature of the veil.
We saw how giant political forces like colonial empires and nationalist movements tried to turn women into silent, flat symbols.
And then we watched all of that theory crash down into the brilliantly complex, messy, contradictory, and utterly human character of Ghita in 1950s Fez.
Ghita forces us to look past the binary. Human beings are incredibly resourceful. They survive within the flawed systems they're forced into, and they find ways to carve out agency, even if it's just moving a hemline or lifting a veil a fraction of an inch.
Which brings us to the lingering question we want to leave you with today. Think about your own life. Think about the flawed top-down systems that you operate within every single day. Whether that's a rigid corporate hierarchy at your job, the cultural expectations of your community, or the deeply ingrained dynamics of your own family. What is your personal patriarchal bargain?
Where are you consciously enforcing rules you might actually disagree with just to maintain your hard-won status or keep the peace?
And where, in the quiet, unseen moments, are you subtly changing the hem of your dress? Because as we've learned today, the official narrative might just show a broken system, but the messy, contradictory margins are where the real living and the real resisting actually happens.